Good morning, and thank you, Paula, for those very kind remarks. And my first remarks are going to be how exceptional it is to be working with Ambassador Dobriansky as the chair of our organization. She said she had big shoes to fill following Ambassador Mark Grossman, and she has more than filled them, and the dynamism and excitement that you, I'm sure, sense about the national organization is because Paula has agreed to be our chair, and I know I'm speaking on behalf of the board and the national network when I say thank you very much, Paula. We really appreciate you joining us and everything you've done for us in your short tenure so far. We're looking forward to the months and years ahead. And welcome to all of you. This is the opening session of our first day, and it is truly my honor to introduce to you our opening keynote speaker and welcome Stephen Hadley back. Steve Hadley has dedicated his life to public service, to strengthening our democracy, and that has not only included his work in government, it has actually included his commitment to educating and engaging the American public on global issues, and his dedication and responsiveness to our network in terms of speaking. And I say this as a bit of warning. I know Ambassador Negroponte knows what I'm talking about, Steve Hadley knows what I'm talking about, but Stone Phillips and KT McFarland, who are coming here for the first time, when you come, you never leave the network, so welcome. It was a year ago, this is really a poignant moment for us as a network. It was a year ago that Steve Hadley challenged us as a network. He opened us last year, and he recognized that one of our strengths was that we're national. We're in 93 communities. He recognized that we were nonpartisan, and we were very well respected in those communities we were in. And he challenged us to take that very unique position we have as an organization throughout the United States and to make a difference. Following a midterm election, where only, I think it was 6% of the American public voted with global issues as a consideration in the midterm election choices. And he had said we are in a very, very poignant historic time. And it was important that we had a discussion and that we picked 6 issues. Since he said those words, we have had a year that has been unbelievable in terms of events that are historic, tectonic shifts, global shifts happening around the world. They've involved political, economic, and natural disasters that have really changed the global stature of not only countries, but regions. And as an organization dedicated to educating the American public on global issues, I know you all know what I'm talking about, that you barely had a chance this year to even absorb what was happening before the next event was happening, and you had to turn around and figure out how you were going to even understand yourself, never mind explain to anyone what's going on. We took up Steve's challenge. As a network, our leadership voted, and with your help, we put together a survey, and our council CEOs voted in February and March on the top 6 issues. As Paula noted, we picked our issues, and they're holding: China, Middle East, U.S. energy policy, Afghanistan, Pakistan, U.S. education, U.S. economic competitiveness. And we are about to launch this year-long public discussion, hopefully to help the American public make informed decisions at this very critical historic time. And I can think of no one better to come back and help launch us in this public discussion than Stephen Hadley, the former National Security Advisor to President Bush, who's had a long career in government, including the Defense Department as an Assistant Secretary, working for Dick Cheney, and these are just a few of the things he's done, and he is for our country and for all of us as Americans. And Steve, we really are looking forward to what you have to say to us today.
Good morning. It's an honor and a privilege to be with you today. As Lori said, I've had an opportunity to meet with World Affairs Councils around the country, and I've enjoyed every one of them. And I've been very much impressed by your work. You bring together all elements of your communities, professionals, journalists, students, academics, interested citizens, for a dialogue on key national security and foreign policy issues, and it has never been more important for our country. We're well into the 2012 election cycle, and so far, if you have been watching the Republican presidential debates, the foreign policy has really not figured. But that will change once we get to a two-person race, and it's important that it does, because we face enormous challenges and difficult decisions for our nation. The reason we talked last year about launching an effort for a national dialogue and a focused set of issues, because my impression from the presidential debates in my lifetime is that the discussion of foreign policy in presidential campaigns has been somewhat less than serious. In my view, it's been superficial. Candidates have resorted to straw man arguments or red herrings. And as I mentioned last year, let me just give you an example. My favorite, of course, was the missile gap between the United States and the Soviet Union of 1960 that figured in the Nixon-Kennedy debates. Senator Kennedy alleged the U.S. was behind the Soviet Union in the number of deployed nuclear-armed ballistic missiles. Turns out, after the election was over, the missile gap evaporated. And it turns out it had been a red herring all along. Most recently was the 2008 campaign, where there was a vigorous debate about whether the United States should talk to its enemies. And I believe that is a straw man argument. Of course we talk to our enemies. The issue is, can we get into a position of strength with our enemies so we can negotiate with them on our terms rather than on their terms. And I think the American people need to insist that the candidates do better, and that we need this cycle to make clear that we will not settle for the superficial foreign policy debates of the past. And that's why I suggested that the World Affairs Council identify the same 6 set of issues, and in 2012 have a focused set of programs addressing those issues. And I'm very pleased that the World Affairs Council has accepted that challenge. You've got a good list. The reason I think it is so important is because if you do have a focused set of programs across the country in all your 90-plus organizations, it will inform the American people on these issues. It can help identify the alternative courses of action that are available to our nation. And it can help build a national consensus on what course our nation should pursue on each of these key issues. And that is regardless of who gets elected in 2012. To make the most of this opportunity, I would urge you to consider inviting political candidates to at least some of your events this year. Candidates for president, but also for the Senate, for the House, for governorships, for your local state legislatures. All are beginning to play, obviously, on the issues of foreign policy. Invite your local media to come. TV, radio, print, bloggers, Twitterers, all these other things that I don't understand, but that my daughters seem to be doing most of the day. And tell the candidates, you don't want to hear their prepared stump speech. You want them to tell you the answers they have in mind to the questions you have posed on the issues you have identified. And don't let them off the hook. Press them until you understand their approach to each of the 6 issues you've identified as key to our future. No straw men, no red herrings, no superficial answers. And I think if you will do this, that the World Affairs Council can make a critical contribution to setting our country's national security and foreign policy on a firm footing going forward. I want to say a word about an issue that is not among your list of 6 key issues, but in my view is a prerequisite to national success on any of these issues, and that is putting our economic house in order. Our nation is struggling with the deepest and longest economic recession since the Great Depression of the 1930s. Our projected economic growth rate is anemic when compared to the surging emerging markets of India, China, Russia, and Brazil. If we do not act, we are looking at a sustained period of American economic weakness. And just look at the recent Federal Reserve statement that's in the front page of the newspapers today. And while we will be in a sustained period of weakness, the global economic leadership is going to move from the United States to other nations. Now, it may be surprising, but I believe this is a national security and foreign policy issue. I think it's perhaps the central national security and foreign policy issue we face. Everything we do overseas, our nation's diplomacy, our economic influence, our national defense, depends on our nation's economy. And our current economic weakness, if it continues, will undermine everything we have stood for in the world over the last 60 years. It will undermine our case that political democracy and free markets not only respond to the highest aspirations of the human spirit, but also are the best way to bring people out of poverty and build a prosperous nation. It will tempt nations seeking to build a prosperous future to believe that perhaps authoritarian regimes and controlled economies are a better bet. And when they learn the truth, countries like Venezuela, it may be too late to turn back. We need to become, once again, the shining city on the hill that President Reagan talked about. To get there, we need to reach a consensus on what combination of spending cuts, tax policy, and private sector incentives are required to get our economy going, to put our people back to work, and to solve the deficit problem. For economic growth and jobs, we need to look to the private sector. It is, after all, the private sector, not the government, that provides 83% of the jobs in our economy. But regrettably, economic growth is not alone going to solve the deficit problem. In 1990, the ratio of public debt to our whole economy, our GDP, was approximately 42%, a big number. The Congressional Budget Office projects that the public debt to GDP will be approximately 80% by the year 2020. There's been a lot of talk about raising taxes on the top 1% and cutting discretionary spending, including and especially defense spending. But these will not be enough to solve our long-term budget problems. There's just not enough money in either place to do that. Defense spending is targeted for a $450 billion reduction over the next 10 years. But even if defense spending was eliminated entirely, we would still have a deficit growing to unmanageable levels in the decade ahead. If you added all the income of the top 1% of American households and taxed it away, confiscated the whole thing, it would still not be enough to prevent an increase in the deficit over the 10-year period. If we are to eliminate the deficit or even just reduce it to manageable levels, we have to tackle our entitlement programs. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid account for $1.5 trillion of our $3.5 trillion total federal spending in fiscal year 2010. By 2035, spending on Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid will account for approximately 15% of our whole economy. We have got to find a way to cut back these entitlement programs And we've got to do it not just for the young people. We've got to do it for people like me, who I, sad to say, am nearing retirement age as well. We have got to do it, and we, in our generation, have to kick in to reduce the burden on our next generation. And if you've got daughters in their 20s like I do, they give me a hard time on this issue. And their view is that I am part of a selfish generation. And I don't have a good answer for that. And the answer we can make is to step up and make our contribution to getting this country back on a sound fiscal and economic footing. But while we face a huge economic and fiscal challenge, my greatest concern is that Americans are beginning to lose confidence in our nation and its future, in our ability to solve the problems we face. I think people are generally wondering, will our children be the first generation of Americans whose standard of living will be lower than their parents? Will our nation continue to lead the world in innovation? Can American firms compete with firms in the emerging economy of powerhouses like China and India? Putting our economic house in order will go a long way toward answering these questions and restoring the confidence of Americans in our nation's future. It will also go a long way toward restoring the world's confidence in America's global leadership. And it is critical for the world, but especially critical for the United States, that we continue to lead the world community. Some Americans are beginning to think that it is time for the United States to set down the burden of global leadership. That we ought to let somebody else take the lead for a while. And this is understandable when we seem so beset by problems here at home. Why shouldn't we give a priority to problems at home over problems overseas? This is not a new tendency in our history. And these periods of isolation have usually been accompanied by protectionism. Protecting our markets and industries at home and shutting out trade and investment from abroad. But history has shown that isolationism and protectionism never made sense for America. In the 1920s and 1930s, such policies contributed to the Great Depression and exacerbated global instability that led to World War II. And they are particularly inappropriate in today's world. For today, economic prosperity at home depends increasingly on what happens abroad. An estimated 34% of our gross domestic product, our economy, depends on foreign trade and foreign direct investment from abroad. Asia, not the United States, not Europe, will be the engine of future global economic growth. By the year 2030, Asia will account for 60% of the global economy. That is up from only 34% in 2009. If you look ahead and ask about economic growth, it is all Asia, all the time. If our nation's businesses do not take part in this Asian economic growth, our economy will not grow to its fullest potential. This means U.S. trade with Asia needs to increase. And we should welcome foreign trade, for it produces good American jobs. For example, jobs supported by our exports of goods pay 13 to 18% more than the national average in terms of wages. And we also need to attract investment from Asia into U.S. businesses here at home to produce jobs for American workers. There's an emerging web of free trade agreements in Asia that is linking the countries of Asia together and leaving the United States on the outside, locked out of the world's fastest growing market. This makes no sense. The United States-South Korean Free Trade Agreement, which was finally ratified by the Congress a week or so ago is an exception to this trend, but it is an agreement which was negotiated 4 years ago and sat 4 years before the Senate had ratified it. We need to make free trade agreements in Asia a priority, and we need to invite, not resist, foreign investment in the United States. Erecting barriers to free trade is a sign that we lack confidence in the ability of American workers to compete globally. But I believe that if we level the playing field for American business, our workers can compete with the best the world has to offer. All they need is a chance. So rather than turning to isolationism and protectionism, the United States must be active in the world so that the global trading and investment rules encourage free, fair, and open trade and investment. America has historically been the leader in the design of the global economic system, and that has led to the prosperity that we have had over the last 5 decades. We need to continue that leadership today. Otherwise, the future will be bad for American business, bad for American workers, and bad for America. It is not only our economic prosperity, but also our security at home that is increasingly linked to what happens abroad. We saw this on 9/11, when 17 terrorists from several Middle East countries plotted in Germany and attacked here in the United States, having trained in Afghanistan, and then conducted an attack that killed 3,000 people from 80 different countries. To prevent such attacks in the future, we not only hardened America here at home, but we took the fight to the terrorists abroad, and we signed up a coalition of over 80 countries to work with us to disrupt terrorist plots aimed at them and aimed at us here at home, and to try to prevent these terrorists from gaining access to weapons of mass destruction, especially nuclear weapons. We recruited over 90 countries into what's called the Proliferation Security Initiative to prevent the international traffic in weapons of mass destruction technologies and equipment. In short, our security at home depends on cooperation with countries abroad. Isolation is not the path to a secure America. And that leads to a broader point. The major 21st century challenges we face as a nation cannot be solved by America acting alone. They require global solutions. The list of challenges is long. You know them. Solving the global financial crisis, getting global economic growth going, ensuring adequate supplies of energy, addressing the environmental impacts of growth, dealing with environmental damage, fighting terrorism, preventing proliferation. It's a long list. And on each of these problems, the United States cannot solve the problem for itself, by itself. These problems can only be solved if the United States, and particularly countries like China and India, will work together with us in a global framework to address these problems. And that international cooperation will not happen unless the United States not only participates, but leads the effort. Why is this so? Why can't someone else put together the global solutions to these global problems? Why does it always have to be us? Why not China? Well, there are 4 reasons for this. First, the United States is still the world's most consequential nation. We have the biggest economy, 2.5 times China. We have the world's most proficient and technologically advanced military by far. We have the world's best universities and a tradition of innovation. Nobody else has the ballast in order to lead the international community. The United States still has great moral authority. We were founded on principles that are respected and admired throughout the world. Freedom, democracy, equal opportunity, justice. And countries of the world look to inspiration from us, whether it's the captive nations of the Cold War or the emerging states from the Arab awakening. Third, the United States is viewed as an honest broker. We don't have a colonial past. We have not engaged in wars for territorial gain, but rather wars to oppose tyranny and advance the freedom of others. And generally, if you go to any region of the world, you'll find that the United States has better relations with each of the countries in that region than any of them have with each other. Look at Asia. The United States has simultaneously strong ties with China, Japan, and South Korea. And if you know those countries, they are better than any of those countries have in terms of relations with each other. They're an enormous resource for the United States and for the world. So finally, there's simply no alternative to U.S. leadership. As you can see from the morning papers every day, Europe cannot move with the necessary speed and decisiveness given the way it's structured itself for the European Union and is consumed by its own economic, social, and demographic problems. And the little secret is that China doesn't want the job of global leader. It's too much of a burden. It's too much of a time sink. It costs too much money. They've got problems at home, and they have their hands full managing those problems. And if you talk to Chinese leaders, they will tell you exactly that. So the bottom line is that the United States advances its own interests by its global leadership, and the world is better for it. The U.S. has a tradition of not just managing problems, but trying to solve them. And the world needs the energy of America's perhaps naive, can-do spirit as it deals with its problems. And by exercising our capabilities as world leader, we both advance our own interests and contribute to a freer, more prosperous, and stable world. And this brings me back to the World Affairs Councils. In your programs for 2012, you can develop the way ahead on the big foreign policy challenges our country faces, and I urge you to do that. At the same time, I hope you will make the case against protectionism and isolationism, and for America's continued engagement and leadership of the global community. And finally, you can remind our nation that we faced enormous challenges in the past, and we have overcome them. Whether it was the Cold War threat of Soviet communism that could have destroyed America with tens of thousands of nuclear weapons, or a global terrorism threat that emerged on 9/11 and sought to bring our nation to its knees through mass casualty attacks. Our ability to surmount these challenges in the past should give us confidence that we can surmount the challenges of the present and win a better future for our children. Thank you very much.